Hello, Ken Spriggs here, coming back with a video after a bit of a delay. Not really a delay, but I was working on the Predator Pod Buddy build with Augie Gonzalez from Interstellar Modeler. So go check that out. In my last video, I showed the final reveal of it. But I'm back on the Discovery, 2001 Discovery, that I'm doing as a commission build. And working on the pod bay, quite a bit more done. A lot of sub-assemblies, a lot of little parts on this pod bay, especially because I'm doing several little lights and little things on it just to add some extra flair to it and some little cool effects. So let's go ahead and check it out and see where we are in this build. All right, so I'm continuing to work on the pod platforms and getting them ready to finish up the connections that I needed. So I added a second set of wired of the square tubes so that I can switch the pod, the one with the lights on it, between the two. All right, so now this can be slid into the left side or it can be slid into the center. The right side is going to be one solid. It's going to be solid. It's going to be glued in. So the right side, I just glued onto some square tubing, and I painted the part that you're going to see. So that's just going to be glued straight into there. I also completed the pod that's going to be switchable with this one here, and I have that ready to go as well. Both of these are painted and decaled. Now this one, of course, like I said, doesn't have any kind of lights or anything, but I wanted it to look the same. So I put a little bit of 5-minute epoxy on the bottom of both of these so it gives it that rounded profile. All right, so I also did a little painting of some black around the edge of this because I'm ready to start putting the decals on. I painted the middle of that one, but I don't really need to. The decal will go in the center and be black, so it'll cover that up. And then so at this point, what I'm ready to do, since these are all painted and ready to go, is to go ahead and put down the big black decal over that whole surface. And I did go ahead and put a coating of dull coat on it, just to kind of give it a little more of a solid structure to it, so it won't break up as much. I first tested it on the decals for the pod platforms, and they worked out fine. I'm not sure, it's hard to tell on these small ones if they were thicker, but they didn't give me any issues as far as sticking on there. And then I got a dull coat on both of these to seal in the paint onto the metal and the resin. All right, so we go ahead and start putting the decals on the floor. And then that's going to wrap up most of this bottom of the pod bay, other than the workbench in the center. And I can work on that independently. All right. Oh my. So I got the decal down on the floor. This was really, really, really challenging. One of the most challenging decals I've ever had to put down. I thought about maybe cutting it into pieces, but the problem is you don't want to cut the black because you'll be able to see the separation. And if you cut the little white parts between that are supposed to show through white, it may not line up right. So the hard part is that all of these openings kept catching on the release film that I kept trying to pull out, but just slow patience, kept dabbing water onto it to keep it from drying out or wrinkling. I really do think painting it with a gloss coat, a flat coat over it, really helped. This was fairly solid. I didn't get any tears, any rips, and it ended up going down onto the floor. And once it's on and it's solid, it looks good. I mean, that looks really great. So glad that that's over. That was a nerve-wracking experience. So I put these down as well, these two right here. The third one, I had painted black inside of it because I wasn't sure, if it needed to be, but I think I made that same exact mistake on my first discovery, because the problem is these little yellow squares in here are actually more of a clear. So if you have white behind it, you can see it. If you have black behind it, it just disappears. And that's what happens. So I went ahead and dabbed some white paint on that. I'm going to let that dry thoroughly before I go back and I put this last decal onto there. And that'll be the end of the decals for the pod bay. Thank goodness. So yes, if you do get this kit, and I love this kit, don't get me wrong, the decals are a challenge. So put a gloss coat on it if you gloss or a semi-gloss or even a flat coat like I did. Build them up a little bit, make them a little more solid. It's easier to work with, but obviously I had to cut out every one of these little sections. I had to cut around the entire thing because it's not cut out. So it wasn't as bad as I thought doing that part. That was pretty easy actually. Most of it I can cut with scissors, and I just went with an X-Acto knife and just cut those little pieces. Just make sure to use a nice sharp X-Acto knife. So, all right, so I'm gonna let that sit. I'm going to let that white paint dry. Once that dries, I'm gonna go ahead and put that last decal on there and let it fully set up. And then I'm going to put a flat coat on this thing and seal that in so this does not come loose. And that seems to work well. Once it's on there and you get it flat coated over top, it's on there really good. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but I wanted to wait until I was done handling this whole thing so I don't have to worry about any more of these. These are all completed. The only thing I have to do is the workbench, which actually I can just attach right in that center and do it separately. And then those three little holes there, you can see those are for some posts for the astronaut suits, which it has some photo etch, but I'm just going to use some of my brass rod. It'll just be easier, and attach some of the photo etch to it because they have some little circular supports for the helmets. I didn't show it, but I also combined those two wires together. I just have it taped off right now to keep it from getting in the way. But those are both together. I can then just attach single wires to those so I can put those into the rest of the power and put some shrink tube over them. But I'm glad that this is done and it survived. So I'll let that all settle, and then I'll put the pods in and show you the final floor at this point. All right, so I got the pod floor and the pod platforms all together and was putting them in, and went to test the light and it didn't work. I was like, what's going on? I've tested it multiple times through this whole process to make sure it was working. So I took this out in order to try moving this over to here to see if maybe I could isolate it to one of the two wires, and it started working. As soon as I put this back in, it stopped working again. And I was like, what is going on here? So I realized that I had this piece of photo etch, it's metal, glued on the bottom of this. So it was inadvertently making a circuit between those two rods because it was touching it. So every time I put this in, I guess it didn't like that, even though it's weird. It's just like a circuit, I guess, because the positive and negative were touching. But anyway, it stopped it from working. So as soon as I took this off and I put it back in, it worked again. I was like, you got to be kidding me. So what I'll have to do is come up with a little piece of styrene plastic I can cut into that shape and put it on so it covers that up and paint it black. So okay, all right, so finally got this all done. Lots of work on that. So before I glue the side back on, or the bottom pieces, or even the back, I want to go ahead and get done with the workbench there in the center and get that wired up for lights. And I can do that independently. And then I have a hole in there once I take the tape off, put the workbench on there, get the wires down through there, and I'll be ready to go ahead and assemble all of this other than the ceiling, the roof with the lights in it. And that'll be the final thing. Well, I'm sorry, not the final thing. I still have to put lights in the maintenance corridor, light the outside of that, and then I'll be able to attach that on as well as the lab area, which is done, and then that'll complete up all those steps and I'll have the pod bay completed. So I have several steps to do, in other words. So let me go ahead and start working on the workbench and then get some progress on this pod bay. All right, so I'm working on the workbench that goes in the middle of the pod bay. And what I'm using is, I have this clear 3D printed version that I got from Carl Darby, from the set that he made for the Discovery. I didn't end up using it on my original one, so I still had it. And so I'll be using it for this build. It's really nicely designed because it has a substantial part sticking out there in the front for the displays. And then the sticker that comes with the green strawberry kit, I can use to add some detail once I paint it black. So what I'm doing is I'm working on lighting up that little display there. You can see the little square and the little HOW over to the right of him. So I was talking to the client that I'm building this for, and he had asked me about whether I was going to use a color changing LED like I did in the lab area. And at first I thought, and had told him that that would be kind of tricky because it's too big for this little teeny bench. But upon looking at it, I realized that it really isn't. It's quite small, and it would work really well to adapt it so that that little screen is actually changing colors. So what I did was I took this LED, as you can see here. I'm not quite sure the size of it, but I sanded one side of it, or a good part of it, flat, as you can see right here. And so it does a couple of things. One, it gives me a nice flat surface to put on the back of this, so the top of it is right over that display. And it doesn't block the little hole for HOW either, because it's nice and small. And then also it will cause the light to diffuse where I sanded that, so it will glow, and I won't have to put anything over it in order to make it look like a display. So what I'm going to do first of all, because that's going to be attached to the back of the workbench, I don't want the light coming through this clear structure, which would make me have to do a lot of light blocking, which I don't really need to do otherwise. So I cut out some UV resistant styrene, which I've used before, and it blocks light. And I cut it out to the back shape of the workbench. So once I glue these together and I drew out the HOW and I cut out the little square, only light's going to come through those parts, and I don't have to worry about the rest. And then once I attach this on, I can light block the back of it so you're not getting any light behind it. So, okay, let me go ahead and get those together, and I think this is going to work out pretty cool. Okay. All right, so as you saw in the previous still, I put a coating of primer, Tamiya Gray Surface Primer, onto the workbench, and then I put some flat black over it from Tamiya as well. I've glued the color changing SMD, the flattened part, against the back of it, and I have the wires going down through the bottom. You can see it in the back, but you're not going to see the back of the bench because it won't be visible when this is inside the pod bay. And then I have a tiny Z SMD red light that I'm going to put through for the little circle for HOW over to the right. Before I do that though, I want to go ahead and apply the stickers that were designed for the pod bay, or for the bench. This is the bench that came with the green strawberry set. So it's not bad, but it's just a solid resin, And that back plate would be really hard to try to put an actual light through it and actually light that up. It's designed to just have that sticker on it so it looks like it's lit up. So okay, let me go ahead and put these onto the bench, and then I can, once I do that, I'm only going to cut out the right side that shows the Howl design. You can see how tiny that is, and I'm going to put that into that little area on the right. Once I do that, I want to poke a hole through for where Howl would be, and then I can go ahead and put the light behind it so you just see the red light. So okay. All right, so I put on the stickers that came with the green strawberry. They look a little choppy, but they show a little bit of detail. I didn't have any other ones that I could use. I wish they were decals and not stickers, but those white strips there on the top, left and right, I used a piece of just self-adhesive striping, and what I do is I just put it down on a piece of styrene, and I use an X-Acto knife to cut smaller little pieces of it, and then just stuck it on there. I put the paper ones on initially, but they look kind of crappy. That front panel is supposed to be on the top according to the instructions, but you weren't really going to see it, and I wanted to see just a little bit of detail. So okay, but I have those both glued on the back and the SMD for Howl, and I have 5-minute epoxy over it, and then I'm going to put some more flat black paint over it so I light block the light from the back of the control panel. So now for the let me zoom in there a little bit. For the display there, it was a little bright, and you can see just a little bit of a hot spot. So I took some thin clear styrene and I scuffed it up. Here's a part of it that I cut it from, and I cut out the piece that would just fit that display on the left side. I had to put a little bit of black paint on the bottom, and then I just glued it in place. So it diffuses a little bit more. And I know this looks rough when it's really up close like this, but when it's further away and it's in the bench, it looks really cool, or in the pod bay. So let me turn that on, see how that looks. And it's going to be kind of washing out some of the lights because of the camera, but it looks pretty cool. Here we go. Actually, it looks pretty cool in the camera. So you can see Howl to the right there, and then you can see the display, and it's changing colors. It looks like a little bit of a hot spot in the camera, but it really isn't. It's nice and even now, and it looks like a display that's just changing colors. So that's pretty cool. And you can see with my finger that still a little bit of light leaks in the back. I just have to touch that up a bit. I went over some of it with some black, but I have to do a little bit more. And then that'll be ready to go into the pod bay. I think that turned out really cool. All right. All right, so I've begun work on the hanging astronaut suits in the back of the pod bay. And I'm using the resin versions, which are kind of cool actually. You can see I put a coating of flat aluminum Tamiya on them. I like doing that because then I put clear Tamiya over top of it, and it gives it more of a metallic look. And then the helmets are separate. As you can see, I did the red helmet. Then I have the blue helmet, already completed, in the blue suit. He's been impaled. Sorry, just glued a little piece of strip on the back of him to kind of keep him away from the bar here. So these are photo etch pieces, and they come in two parts. You have the stem, which looks like this, and then you fold down two halves and glue them together. And then you have this part here, which you fold and you glue it in the middle like this. And the helmet gets glued on the top on that little disc, and the suit gets glued on the bottom, hanging down, and there's a space between them. So you can see I have the helmet already glued for the blue one on the top. Sorry, it's hard to get a focus on that. Okay. letting that dry, and then I'm gonna paint the photo etch, I think like flat aluminum as well when I'm done. And then once that, I put that little post, I took a pin device and drilled a little hole in the back of him and glued a little piece of styrene so that it will be able to be glued to the back of this, because when he's hanging from that post, the body's hanging out a little bit and I don't want it to be secured only on that piece of metal. So all that I'm going to be doing, because at this point Dave and Frank are outside of the ship, so I'm just going to have the blue spacesuit on the right side, nothing in the middle, and then on the left side just the red helmet on the top, sort of like this but with the red one, and no spacesuit since Dave left the ship and didn't take a spacesuit. I'm not going to use the other two for this, but I am working with some 3D printed figures that I got from Shapeways that I had used in my original build. Probably one of these two. I'm going to make it a figure of Dave who returned to the ship through the airlock, and he's going to have his red suit on but the green helmet because he's on his way to deactivate HAL. And the client wanted to have him in the main pod bay rather than in the maintenance corridor, so he's going to be walking through there like he's on his way to shut down HAL. So okay, so I need to get him painted aluminum and then put some colors on there as well. All right. All right, and here are the 3 painted parts for the hanging astronaut. It's very tiny, as you can see. So there's the blue suit for the right side, separated helmet. The center one is empty. And I painted these posts flat aluminum so they would look like they are metallic. And then there's the red helmet on the otherwise empty post that Dave forgot to take with him when he foolishly left the ship. It was kind of a side view. All right, so very tiny, very delicate. So they're ready to go inside. I'm gonna wait until I'm done with the other parts before these get glued into place inside the pod bay. Okay. All right, so I got myself a new little tool from Amazon, and it's this long arm bracket. It clamps down onto my workbench, and on the top it has this little part here that holds my cell phone, my iPhone 11, which is what I use to 11 or 12. I think it's a 12 that I use to film it. And so what I want to do is try to get some more close-up shots of the actual work that I'm doing, because I realize I don't do a lot of that, since most of the time I'm holding it in my hand like I am right now, just moving it around. So it's really hard to do that. So this makes it hands-free for me, and I can move it in and out and that kind of thing. So I'm going to play with this a little bit, so bear with me. But I want to show doing a little more detailed work with that. So, all right, so I'm painting one of the Shapeways 3D printed figures that I still had left over from my first set. I had a couple, and I painted them both with flat aluminum from Tamiya. The same that I did on the hanging spacesuit, so I can get a metallic look when I paint some clear over them. So I decided on this one because his helmet shape is a little bit better than the other one. It looks a little more realistic. So what I'm going to do primarily on these is I'm going to paint over the aluminum with some clear red for the main suit and some clear green for the helmet, because I'm recreating the part of the film where Dave came in through the airlock and he puts on the green helmet. He still has on his red suit. His red helmet is still hanging on the wall, and he's going to deactivate HAL because he wouldn't let him in. So first we're going to go ahead and we're going to paint on the red, which is the primary color of his suit. All right. And I just temporarily glued him onto this little piece of plastic with some CA glue, so it makes it easier to work with, and he's easier to pull off as well. So the nice thing about the clears is that you can put them on however thick you want them, and if they don't look quite right over the metallic, you can go back and paint some more. I'm avoiding his chest plate and the back plate because they're going to be orange. Likewise, his boots are going to be a light gray. Okay, you can probably see there it's a little lighter. It's not quite as red as I want it to be, so I just put it a little heavier. And I can always come back to and put some more on if I need to. Hope this is all in frame. And if I do a little too much of the red over where some of the other things are, it's no big deal. Once it dries, I can paint over it with the right color. Okay, a little bit more on the front. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry for a few minutes, and then I will go ahead and do the other colors and clean my brush off as well. All right, so I've cleaned off my brush, and I'm gonna go ahead and start using some clear green on the helmet. Figured I would do the main suit colors with the clear first, and then I will go back and do the other parts like his boots and his front and back oxygen tanks or backpacks. So, all right, and this is just going to go on the helmet. And it's a little trickier because I don't want to get the faceplate. I want to do that with some Tamiya smoke to make it look dark. The back is easy. But the front is where it comes around the sides, so it's tricky. This 3D printed one is pretty nice. It actually has a fairly nice defined helmet part versus the visor, so it's a little easy to see where it goes. It's still just the merest of paint. Be very gentle with this. If I put a little too much on, I can use a X-Acto knife to scrape it off a little. But still very tricky at this scale, obviously. Clears are tricky too because you gotta put them on fairly heavy and let them self-level. All right, so we'll let that go for a few minutes and let that dry. Clean my brush again, and we'll go on and work on some of the backpack orange. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and paint the front and back backpacks. And for this, I'm using Model Masters acrylic fluorescent red, which is actually really orange. I don't know why they call it fluorescent red. It's very orange. So, but it works out well. It looks good. I used it on the one hanging on the back, and I think it looks good. All right, so I'm just going to go over the two backpacks, and then I'll try to add the tiniest bit of detail. It's kind of tricky because it's so small. It's a little heavy, so we'll take some off the brush on the back. And I hope that's in frame. It's a bit tricky. Spill it. Okay. All right, looking pretty good. I will let that dry. Clean off my brush again. And then I still have to do some silver for the straps. I want to let that dry a little bit. I'll probably do some gray for the boots, and then come back and do the visor and the silver highlights. All right, so I'm going to get and paint the boots. We're using some sky gray. It's a very light gray. And I'm not worried about getting the bottom of the boots because, well, first of all, it's glued onto the styrene for the moment. But once I glue it onto the pod bay, you're not going to see that anyway, the bottom. So I'd rather have like bare resin. So a little bit of gray. Kind of start at the bottom and then work my way up a bit. Just a little. I kind of figure I'm going to show the left side of him. He's moving across from the airlock across the pod bay to go over and deactivate house. So that's mainly the side I'm concerned about you seeing. All right, looks pretty good. So got some gray in his boots. All right. Again, clean off my brush, let that sit for a few minutes. Go ahead and do some Tamiya smoke for the visor. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and use some Tamiya smoke, which is pretty much like a clear black or gray, and I'm going to use that for the helmet. I like how it looks because it's dark, and certainly these helmets are dark. You can't really see through, and there's no face obviously, so I'm not going to worry about that. For this one, because it's such a tiny little area, I am going to use a toothpick to just lightly dab some around and keep it in that general area. I want this on fairly heavily. Give the impression of a visor. Sorry if that's not fully in frame. All right, that looks pretty cool. So I will let that dry a little bit. One more thing I have to do is some silver, very thin lines for his, like straps for his orange oxygen tanks, his front and back backpacks. So, all right, for the last little bit of silver details, I'm going to use chrome silver from Tamiya. I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I've done this before when dealing with a really fine little stripes. I'm going to use a piece of wire. This is just a solid wire that has plastic, and I stripped it off, and I just bent it just a little bit on the end so I can just kind of dab it in and just get something as thin as this piece of wire, just to do like some straps, as it were, metallic straps on top of this. So see if I can get this in camera. Because they're just ever so thin. Just to add a little bit of metallic color. And I'm sorry if you can't see that in camera. It's real tricky to get this. It's not too bad. Okay, and maybe just a little on his wrists. Kind of give that impression of the connectors. And on his boots. I'm just doing a tiny little bit on the backpack. Just give it a tiny impression of some detail. I think that should do it. All right, so we'll let that completely dry. And then I think I'll take a little bit of just some very light, maybe some white pastel powders over it to just dull down just a slight bit of that green. We'll see. But that should be done, and I'll show you how he looks when he's all completed. All right, and there is my finished astronaut for Dave Bowman with the red suit and the green helmet. Sorry if he's a little out of focus. I use just a little bit of white weathering powders to just dull down the super gloss. It always makes it look more realistic, but it's still glossy, especially at this tiny little scale. Okay. All right, so he's all set. So all I have to do is get him into the pod bay with the astronaut suits, and we're ready to close up most of the pod bay. All right, so I have most of the pod bay put together, except for the left wall and the ceiling. Try to hold that steady. There's Dave Bowman with his green helmet and red spacesuit, heading towards the lab door to go up and deactivate HAL. There are all the spacesuits in the back. Well, the blue spacesuit and then the red helmet. I just imagine Dave walking by that red helmet and being like, damn it, damn helmet. But he survived. Well, he could have kind of survived and got back into the pod bay. I put on the little supports at the bottom for the pod platforms to go out. I have those glued in. I just put some extra stripping coming out at the bottom, as you can see, just to give it some character. I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. And the bottom glued back on, obviously. So this sits, let me sit it down, make it a little bit easier for no shaking. So it sits down flat. All right, it's looking pretty cool. The workbench is wired in and lit up. I have the little light in the control panel, a little red light over here lit up, or wired in. And then the lab area is all ready to go once I'm get it all together. I still have to finish up the ceiling lights and then put the lights around the maintenance corridor over here. So, all right, let me go ahead and get the last wall on, and then I want to just put those lights on and kind of give you an idea of what those are going to look like. All right, so there we go. I put the roof on because then you can see those lights a little bit better. Sorry if it's not focusing. Try to get a focus on there. The bench you can see nice and clear, but the red light in the back doesn't want to focus. Sorry. Come on. Okay. All right. I wanted that light to be very subtle anyway. It's not supposed to be a big glaring red light, just like HAL. You can see HAL, but he's not supposed to be, you know, really shining out super bright. But there's the workbench changing colors, looking pretty sweet. And there's no overhead lights, obviously, so you're not seeing the other details as much. I'm trying to get some light shining in there. You can see Dave back there heading towards the door. Spacesuits hanging up on the racks, what's left of them. The supports for the pod platforms coming out. All right, so pretty much the interior pod bay is completed. I'm not going to put the roof on yet until I get the lights obviously put onto it. The left lab area is ready to go. I just have to get that glued in place when I'm ready to do so. And then I still have to light the maintenance corridor. So I'll be working on those next time. But that's going to go ahead and wrap this up for this week. So stay tuned. I will be working on this more and pretty much wrapping up this pod bay here shortly. All right. All right, so that's going to wrap up this build for this week. Quite a bit done on the pod bay. I will be completing that on the next video, obviously. All I have to do is work on the lights for the maintenance corridor and the ceiling. There is quite a bit to do on those because I have to actually carve out some of the parts on the top of the ceiling so the lights set down inside, and do some work on that. So, all right, so stay tuned. I will be finishing up the pod bay, as I said, and then begin working on the cockpit. All right, thanks to all my new subscribers, and stay tuned.